Archaeo-astrology, the Sphinx mystery.
Just like the cycles of birth, life, and death, within the 26,000-year cycle, referred to as the Great Year, there are extended periods of darkness and light. These are divided into distinct ages, known as the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age.
The ancients themselves told us that history, mankind would go into a dark age. 4,000, 5,000 years ago, they view the past as the Golden Age. They see themselves moving into the Dark Age and they dread it because they know that things are going to get worse, they're going to get chaotic. Cultures all around the world are talking about this pre-Dark Age, that things are going downhill.
I really ascribe to the Mayan and the Hindu idea that the Golden Age, the time of connection into the divine wisdom, was actually a long time ago. And we've been moving through periods of increasing densification, increasing alienation from the spiritual light.
Golden Ages are times of enlightenment, when civilizations reach high points in architecture, spirituality, and benevolence. This is considered to decline slightly in the Silver Age, further deteriorating in the Bronze Age, and reaching extreme levels of chaos, corruption, and ignorance in the Iron Age or Dark Age. Then, the cycle works its way back up to the next Golden Age. One of the ways to measure the 26,000-year Yuga cycles is through the ages of the zodiac, which the ancient Egyptians clearly understood.
The origin of the zodiacal signs is a very good question, actually, and probably impossible to determine. The only one of the signs that vaguely looks like what it's supposed to is Leo the lion. The stars making up Virgo definitely don't look like a virgin, whatever a virgin looks like these days. And the other signs are equally mysterious, the crab, the bull, etc., etc. Knowledge of precession and advanced astronomy existed in extremely distant times. The basis of the signs themselves, in terms of zodiac, the wheel of life or the wheel of animals, there are different translations of that. I mean, if you really want to know what the signs signify, you have to go into the qualities and properties of the signs themselves. In other words, each sign is male or female. Each sign is fire, earth, air, water.
Each of the 12 signs of the zodiac has distinct energies. There are 4 elements: earth or material signs, air or intellectual signs, water or emotional signs, and fire or creative signs. By looking at the 12 zodiacal ages of about 2,000 years each, we can rethink the Egyptians' concepts of time and recreate the chronology.
There is a gap in our historical record.
The Palermo stone and the Turin papyrus are evidence from the Egyptians themselves and convey information from rulers far back in Egyptian history.
And they give the regnal years and the name of each of these rulers. And when you compute all of those names and put the numbers together, you get a date somewhere around 36,000 BC. At the same time, roughly, that 34,000 year date corresponds to the Vedas of India, the Vedic civilization of India, which also gives a date which, when you work it out, comes out to something like 40,000 years before our current era. So we have 2 great sophisticated civilizations that have documented their own belief that their civilization started back around that kind of time.
It is interesting to note that this is roughly 1.5 precessional cycles ago, dating back to a previous golden age.
The Sphinx, with its lion body, screams out as a Leo symbol, as a marker for an age of Leo. The last age of Leo had its ingress at around 10,500 BC. So that's the date favored by Graham and by Robert Bauval. I'm hesitant to accept that date myself because the last ice age comes to a catastrophic end somewhere around 11,000, 11,500 BC. I mean, it certainly followed, and this is known, there are the quaternary extinctions. All the mammoths and the woolly rhinoceroses die all over the world. Siberia, which was temperate, becomes tundra and Arctic. North America, which was under a couple of miles of ice sheet, melts, and all that water goes into the sea. The sea rises 300 feet over the course of a couple of thousand years, but in stages, and some of those stages very precipitous, maybe corresponding to the biblical flood and possibly Plato's Atlantis myth. So under these circumstances, which are catastrophic the world over, to me, it seems unlikely that the Sphinx and the pyramids, which presuppose a settled and stable and sophisticated society, could have built those amazing structures under those kinds of conditions. So that leaves anything before 10,500 BC, but I like the idea of the Leo symbolism. So the next age of Leo back is 26,000 years earlier, and that puts it back at around 36,000 BC, which, outrageous as it sounds, by a process of exclusion, turns out to be maybe less outrageous because there are big problems with those other later dates.
Looking at the weathering on the Sphinx and the Sphinx enclosure, that weathering was clearly formed by runoff from precipitation.
It is indeed water weathering and precipitation induced, so it has to have been done in the distant past, and the question then is, how distant was that past?
It could take tens of thousands of years for the Nile to have migrated 8 miles. Can we use this evidence to redate these monuments?
When you look at geology, you can see that the riverbed has migrated all the way from the west, beyond 50 kilometers to the west. Then it passed across the plateau, and you can see that the ancient riverbed actually went right up to the pyramids, and the initiates could have stepped right off these barges up onto the causeways into the pyramids. Now, if you look, the Nile is a full 8 miles to the east, and it's the dividing point between Cairo and Giza. And so if we look at geological time, it would take several tens of thousands of years in order for the Nile to make that migration. We can compare that to places like Tiahuanaco in Bolivia that almost certainly was on the edge of Lake Titicaca, and now it's 50 miles away. So it changes the whole idea of how ancient these places could have been.
How many thousands of years does it take for a river to make this huge journey? The oases of El Khaga and Fayoum run parallel to the Nile today, but 100 kilometers west. It seems that the river migrated all the way from here to its current course. Evidence of ancient human settlements has been found in the area that is now desert, but once had water. At these locations are stone circles, indicating a knowledge of astronomy. What does it tell us about the distant past? What can we conclude about the dating of the pyramids and the Sphinx?
And all I can really say at this point, given the data I have, is that I think it has to be at least back to 5000 BC. Could it be older? In fact, might it well be older? Yes. Generally, if sort of pressed for dates, I'll say my best estimate is somewhere in the period of 7000 to 5000 BC. So that's really a working range that I'm comfortable with. We're also finding elsewhere in Egypt and around the world that other things were happening in that same period, 7,000 to 5,000 approximately BC, that to me puts the Sphinx into a larger regional and global setting, that it's not just an isolated thing. It doesn't seem as isolated as it did 15 years ago when we had less knowledge. You come to tentative conclusions. If more data comes in that seems to indicate something else, I don't ever want to be afraid to change my conclusions or go where the evidence takes me.
I'll stick with my extreme 36,000 BC date until proved otherwise, and if proved otherwise, I will change my mind.
Greetings, Collective Coven, and welcome to another Book-umentary in the Archaeo-astrology series. My name is Trey, aka Taboo Tarot Reader, author of Astrology for Divination and Archaeo-astrology, Decolonize Your Horoscope. In this Book-umentary, we'll be centering the mystery of the Sphinx. I hope you enjoyed the prelude excerpt from the documentary series, The Pyramid Code, made by the late Dr. Carmen Bolter, rest in power. It is an amazing 5-episode documentary that plants seeds of curiosity, hopefully, and it synthesizes really important scholarship from a variety of brave power players in the archaeoastronomy field, such as Dr. Robert Bauval, Graham Hancock, the late John Anthony West. John Anthony West in the 1990s, along with geologist Robert Schoch, famously proposed an alternative chronology for the Sphinx, opening up a debate about its true antiquity. Water erosion on the Sphinx is indisputable. So let's dive deep into deconstructing the patriarchal gaslight they call history. In Serpent in the Sky, John Anthony West summarizes French scholars Swallow de Lubic's groundbreaking work, The Temple of Man, and John Anthony West said that there was one line in which Swallow de Lubic said that the Sphinx exhibited water erosion, and John Anthony West thought that if we could get geologists to prove this, then it would be the smoking gun to disrupt the paradigm of settler colonial false narratives which surround ancient Kemet. Through both positive and negative evidence, in Serpent in the Sky, John Anthony West walks us through why the water erosion on the Sphinx is indisputable proof that it was constructed at a time before the period we understand to be dynastic Egypt of the pharaohs. If there is heavy water erosion on the Sphinx, when was the last time that there was such heavy rainfall in the Sahara Desert? Let's read an excerpt now from Serpent in the Sky from the late, great John Anthony West.
A realistic approach to the mystery suggests alternatives that are unacceptable to the orthodox mind. The first is that Egyptian civilization did not develop in situ, but was brought to Egypt by hypothetical conquerors. This alternative simply translates the mystery of a period of development to the as-yet undiscovered homeland of these conquerors. The second alternative is that Egypt did not develop her civilization, but inherited it. The implications of this alternative are obvious. If the coherent, complete, and interrelated system of science, religion, art, and philosophy of Egypt was not developed by the Egyptians but inherited, and perhaps reformulated and redesigned to suit their needs, that system came from a prior civilization possessing a high order of knowledge. In other words, this alternative brings up the old question of Atlantis. Despite ingenious cultural and philological arguments put forward by supporters of Atlantis, The scholarly consensus at the moment is that evidence for its existence is circumstantial and inconclusive, but a single remark made by Schwaller de Lubis takes the Atlantis question out of philology and into geology, where in principle verification would pose fewer problems. On the other hand, there is the chronological account of the Egyptians themselves. Egyptian chronological tables have been found in the course of excavation which date the founding of Egypt much earlier than the dynastic record. All the writers of antiquity who had any contact with Egypt related tales of such tables. Unfortunately, there is no tablet or papyrus that is complete upon these crucial earlier periods, and there are many inconsistencies among the sources. Nevertheless, there is agreement in a very broad sense. The various sources postulate a long period during which Egypt was ruled by the Neters, and then another, almost equally long period, during which it was ruled by the Shemsu-Hor, the companions of Horus. The chronology is impossible to disentangle, and in some cases it depends upon the manner of calculation chosen. But the earliest calculation would place the founding of Egypt around 30,000 BC, the latest around 23,000 BC. The discrepancy is obviously very large. It is at least worth remarking that while the sources are independent, the discrepancy lies within a single order of magnitude. Herodotus quotes one of his guides as saying that in Egyptian history, the sun had twice risen where it now set, and twice set where it now rises. This remark Schwaller de Lubis interpreted as a description of the passage of 1.5 precessional cycles. This would place the date of foundation around 36,000 BC, a date in broad agreement with the other sources. To this evidence must be added the ubiquity of legends of catastrophes and floods, the arguments put up by catastrophists within geological and other scientific circles, the cultural, scientific, linguistic, and mathematical correspondences found between the civilizations of Central America and Egypt. In summary, Schwaller de Lubis' documented interpretation of ancient Egypt, his observation regarding the water erosion of the Sphinx, and the train of deductions following upon that observation throw open the old question of Atlantis. The case for Atlantis, if not incontestable, is powerful, consistent, and supported from a number of independent but complementary angles. Here are the salient points. 1. Egyptian civilization was complete at its beginning. There is no sign of a period of development. 2. Weathering on the body of the Sphinx is typical of water erosion elsewhere. 3. It is almost impossible to attribute this erosion to wind, sand, insolation, or chemical reaction, since the Sphinx was buried in sand for most of its putative history. 4. There is a complete lack of similar erosional effects on other Egyptian temples and monuments exposed to the elements for as long or longer. 5. The attribution of the Sphinx to Khephren is based upon flimsy, circumstantial evidence. And 6. The architectural style and building scale of the Sphinx and Sphinx Temple complex are unlike anything else in dynastic Egypt.
Rest in power, John Anthony West, who passed on to the Duat in 2018.
Quote, "For the establishment, this is bad news and worse news. The bad news is there was an Atlantis, and the worst news is they were black." End quote.
Egyptology saw its colonial beginnings as, quote, armchair anthropology, unquote, and it was one great grift that just keeps on grifting. Egyptology, since its inception, has been a quagmire of white supremacy fantasy. Egyptology is deeply complicit with the theft, displacement, and exodus of countless stolen artifacts which made the corrupt Council of Antiquities and Egyptian government rich. These stolen artifacts still sit in European museums, the Vatican, and bougie mob bosses' private art collections. All jokes aside, Egyptology has nefarious political motivations to protect its whitewashed history of ancient Egypt at all costs because that protects modern Arab Egypt's tourist economy. What do Eurocentric Egyptologists share in common with modern Arab Egyptians? Deep anti-black racism. Both parties are in denial of Kemet and Nubia's prehistoric black African roots. Once you acknowledge the political implications of ancient Kemet being a black African civilization, then you can start to perceive the hidden shadow power dynamics which have obscured, whether consciously or unconsciously, this fascinating truth. In Black Genesis, Robert Bauval and Thomas Brophy set out to right this great historical wrong by raising awareness about the archaeo-astronomy mystery of the Naphtali stone circle in the deep deserts of Egypt's border with Sudan. This ancient stone calendar is a smoking gun which proves that ancient Nubia was the prehistoric mother culture of later dynastic Egypt, or Kemet. We can speculate that this is likely given the stone circle's astronomical alignments to Orion's belt, which the three Giza pyramids also are aligned to. Whilst the true dates of the Giza pyramids are also of extreme antiquity in my humble opinion, Naphtali is a site with multiple geological layers that surely go beyond 30,000 years ago. Therefore, it is highly likely that Naphtali predates even the extreme age of the Giza Plateau by a good margin, meaning that whichever mother culture constructed Naphtali was the source of ancient Egyptian civilization. To synthesize the Sahara Stonehenge smoking gun, Naphtali suggests that ancient Egypt's advanced astronomy initially developed during a prehistoric Black African civilization. Once you deconstruct internalized supremacy ideologies, it makes logical sense that ancient Atlantis was a Black African civilization, since paleontology and genetics both confirm that humanity evolved out of Africa. It is difficult for some reason for certain groups of people to accept all the evidence which keeps piling up supporting Afrocentric ancient Atlantis. As more archaeological sites continue to be excavated, like Dukigel in Sudan, it becomes more probable that ancient Kemet inherited its sacred sciences from a prehistoric Nubian matriarchal civilization called Tasseti. Egyptology for a long time actively tried to downplay the dynasties which were ruled by Nubian pharaohs, so many casual seekers are unconscious of ancient Nubia's deep connections with ancient Egypt. Eurocentric Egyptology's main lie was ridiculous to begin with. That ancient Egypt was a Euro-adjacent, white-ish civilization in Africa. Therefore, to make a long story short and sweet, Egyptologists are professional gaslighters, not scholars. Perhaps Eurocentric Egyptology's traditional chronology is built on a house of sand. Let's dive deep into the hidden history of ancient Nubia, which is known as modern-day Sudan. Hashtag Eyes on Sudan. This information is via the YouTube channel African History Fountain.
Before Egypt, Tasseti, Africa's early powerhouse, circa 7000 BCE. In 2014, the oldest permanent structure on Earth was discovered in Sudan with a date range of an astonishing 70,000 years. This finding is referred to as Afad 23 and is older than any permanent structure outside of the African continent. According to Archaeology Wiki, quote, "The remains of a settlement estimated to be 70,000 years old have been unearthed by Polish archaeologists in Sudan, a find that seems to contradict the previously held belief that the construction of the permanent structures was associated with the so-called Great Exodus from Africa and occupation of the colder regions of Europe and Asia. The site, known as Afad 23, is currently the only one recorded in the Nile Valley, which shows that early Homo sapiens built sizable permanent structures and had adapted well to the wetland environment. This new evidence suggests that humans reached a much more advanced level of development and adaptation in Africa during the Middle Paleolithic, i.e. 300,000 to 50,000 BCE." End quote.
So right here we have evidence that an advanced civilization had the time window to evolve.
In 1962, a research team of the University of Chicago Oriental Institute Nubian expedition discovered a pharaonic dynasty deep in inner Africa to the far south of Egypt, which predated the first pharaonic period in Egypt, i.e. in Sudan. And a March 1979 edition of the New York Times carried an article on its front page titled "Ancient Nubian Artifacts Yield Evidence of Earliest Monarchy." In the article, we are told that, quote, "Evidence of the oldest recognizable monarchy in human history, preceding the rise of the earliest Egyptian kings by several generations, has been discovered in artifacts from ancient Nubia." He estimated that the first kings of Ta-Seti may well have ruled about 5,900 BC. End quote. Quote, "The Egyptians themselves claim that their ancestors were strangers who in very remote times settled on the bank of the Nile, bringing with themselves the civilization of their mother country, the art of writing, and a polished language. They had come from the direction of the setting sun, and that they were the most ancient of men." End quote, via Diodorus of Sicily, Biblioteca Historica.
If you are defensive or in denial, immediately crying conspiracy theory regarding a systemic cover-up of ancient Kemet being a black African civilization, then you likely haven't done much research into the topic yourself. Eurocentric Egyptology has created a web of lies which functions like a force field of fear, deeply resistant to new ideas and theories in order to hide the obvious. If Kemet were finally recognized as a black African civilization and the source of civilization itself, then Egyptology's entire paradigm and the matrix of white supremacy would crumble. Egyptology would have to admit it has been painfully wrong about Egyptian civilization. Egyptology would have to reckon with its settler colonial origins. Egyptology would have to unmask itself for what it really is in the unlikely event it finally admits accountability. How many more noses on Egyptian statues have to be destroyed before the cognitive dissonance disappears and you realize we are not dealing here with simple academic skepticism?
Quote, "We have here extraordinary history of the world. Maybe after some years we will have Sudanology as strong as Egyptology." End quote. Charles Bonnet, Professor Emeritus at the Institut de France and Académie des Inscriptions et Belles Lettres. Pardon-moi, mon français, c'est merde.
In the top right corner, we see evidence that the Book-umentary sacred writing system, called hieroglyphs by the Greeks, were also found in ancient Tasseti circa at least 7000 BCE. Now the Egyptians as well later on referred to the netters, for these could be translated as the principles or archetypes which became the Egyptian gods and icons. This is further proof that ancient Kemet inherited its sacred sciences from an earlier matriarchal mother culture. When I say that Egyptology is built on a house of sand, by house of sand I mean all of mainstream Eurocentric Egyptology's primary theories are distortions, assumptions, and deflections of the truth. Case in point, hieroglyphics. When you hone in on any aspect of ancient Egypt, we must acknowledge there are mysteries within mysteries, layers upon layers of unconscious blind spots. Therefore, nobody has the authority to claim with 100% certainty this is exactly what a hieroglyph means, and it corresponds with this letter in the Greco-Roman alphabet. The ancient Egyptians, and most likely the ancient Nubians who created the Book-umentary, aka hieroglyphs, weren't waiting around for the Greco-Roman alphabet to be created. Hieroglyphs remain an enigma, and all modern translations of ancient Egyptian writings coming from the Western mind should be studied with discernment.
Quote, populations and cultures now found south of the desert roam far to the north. The culture of Upper Egypt, which became dynastic Egyptian civilization, could fairly be called a Sudanese transplant, unquote, via Egypt and Sub-Saharan Africa, their Interaction Encyclopedia of Pre-Colonial Africa by Joseph O. Vogel.
The defacing of Egyptian statues is obviously fueled by anti-black racism in order to obscure the fact that in antiquity, black Africans dominated. Eurocentric Egyptologists refuse to even allow discussion about the taboo A word, aka Atlantis, like the spineless cowards they are, because Atlantis debunks white supremacy. This explains the mediocre straight white man's irrational fear about simply discussing those dangerous concepts we call hypotheticals, ideas, possibilities, and probabilities. Why is there a deep force field of fear surrounding the way we are allowed to think about the past? Why does Egyptology and archaeology and science, supposedly rational disciplines devoted to objectivity, violently police critical thinking, just like the Vatican? Perhaps because open discussion leads to curiosity, which leads to questioning dogma, which leads to questioning authority in academia, which leads to questioning the mediocrity of the meritocracy, which hopefully leads to the realization that higher academia of the global north is built on white supremacy's house of sand.
Hashtag matriarchy. Balance, not dominance. A number of women had the title Kentucky, which means Queen Mother. Roman literature referred to them as Kandachi. Some of the women were heads of state. Kentucky Karhata, circa the 25th dynasty, 639 BC, had her own pyramid built at Al-Kuru.
Contrary to the patriarchal propaganda and gaslighting of modern male-dominated sky daddy religions, in ancient matriarchal cultures, spirituality was women's wisdom. On the right, we see evidence that the Egyptian netters, or gods, were already present in ancient Tasseti circa 7000 BCE, which was certainly a matriarchal culture. So this begs the question, was patriarchal dynastic Egypt's sacred science stolen women's wisdom from the queen mothers of ancient Tasseti? Hashtag the Matilda effect. Google it. In order to integrate this deeply obscure truth, curious seekers about the ancient mysteries must acknowledge 1. That there is, was, and has been a systemic conspiracy to cover up ancient Egypt's black African origins. 2. That there is, was, and has been systemic destruction of evidence, and this destruction is politically motivated. And 3. That there is, was,
and has always been, a Christian biblical fantasy underlying Eurocentric Egyptology, which romanticizes and distorts ancient Egypt into something that it's not, i.e. a white-ish civilization in Africa, which used slaves to build the pyramids as tombs for one egomaniac pharaoh, the OG overt narcissist. Ergo, it is indisputable that Egyptology is deeply mired in the superiority fantasies and ideologies of white supremacy, settler colonialism. Otherwise, it would not continue to deflect the reality that ancient Egypt was black. With this expanded cultural and historical context, hopefully we now have a greater understanding of ancient Nubia being a probable candidate for a long-lost civilization which constructed the Sphinx, a relic of this mysterious legacy wisdom system which ancient Kemet seemingly inherited. Let's now dive deeper into the mystery of the Sphinx and center the female pharaoh Hatshepsut, the OG Queen Mother. Mother Superior, Reverend Mother. Who was Pharaoh Hatshepsut truly? Hatshepsut clearly sought to align her public image and legacy with Sphinx iconography, invoking the Sekhmet archetype. Few people may understand Hatshepsut's bloodline connects her to the more famous Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Tutankhaten, aka Tutankhamun, aka King Tut, who came later in the 18th dynasty. All four share the distinction of being royals whom the Amun priesthood sought to erase from the king's list. Why was this royal bloodline at mortal odds with the Amun priesthood? Why did Hatshepsut's immediate male successors attempt to destroy so many of her statues? Was Hatshepsut merely a girl boss taken down by mediocre misogynists? Or is there a deeper history here? If Hatshepsut had been male, she likely would have been remembered as one of the most successful pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Yet her legacy as a female pharaoh has been devalued, distorted, and discarded into the shadows. Hatshepsut's stepson conspired with the patriarchal Amun priesthood against her, so her reign was tainted by familial intrigue and constant political threats. Thus, what does Pharaoh Hatshepsut's reign truly represent to us modern humans during patriarchy's extinction burst? We know that Hatshepsut's reign was a brief but remarkable 22 years of patronage to the arts. Hatshepsut's reign manifested stunning sculptures, mind-bending megalithic architecture, and flourishing economic trade. Hatshepsut publicly sought to reconcile with Egypt's neighbors in order to re-establish ancient trade routes, for example, with Punt. Hatshepsut was a wise and able ruler whose temple at Deir el-Bahri stands out as one of the most impressive. There are many mysteries regarding this beautiful temple worthy of an entire book. In a nutshell, I intuit that Deir el-Bahri was Hatshepsut's mortuary manifesto, invoking a return to Kemet's matriarchal source, or original spiritual values, before the decline into the corrupt patriarchal era known as dynastic Egypt. It was likely in this past period of the lost civilization of Atlantis which manifested the Sphinx as we have thus explored. So if Hatshepsut represented a return to ancient matriarchy, then what's underneath her seeming obsession with Sphinx sculptures and depicting herself as a Sphinx? To unveil Pharaoh Hatshepsut's true story, we must understand the political context in which she reigned. Hatshepsut ascended to the throne because her stepson, Thutmose III, was only 2 years old when her half-brother husband, Pharaoh Thutmose II, died. Several years into her regency, Pharaoh Hatshepsut declared herself king, making her a co-ruler alongside Thutmose III. In order to establish herself in the Egyptian patriarchy, Pharaoh Hatshepsut took on traditionally male roles and was depicted with physically masculine traits and traditional male garb, such as the false beard. Pharaoh Hatshepsut sought to convey the idea that she was both a mother and a father to the realm. Pharaoh Hatshepsut's reign was a period of great prosperity and general peace. One of the most prolific builders in ancient Egypt, she oversaw Large-scale construction projects such as the Karnak Temple complex, the Speos Artemidos, and most famously the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut at Deir al-Bahri. Hatshepsut probably died in year 22 of the reign of Thutmose III. Towards the end of the reign of Thutmose III and into the reign of his son Amenhotep II, an attempt was made to remove her from official accounts of Egyptian historiography. Her statues were destroyed, her monuments were defaced, and many of her achievements were ascribed to other pharaohs. Hashtag the Matilda effect.
The lioness, Sekhmet, and Sphinx archetypes in the art invoke the empowered feral feminine, cosmic cyclical consciousness, and a return to Kemet's matriarchal past.
The traditional chronology of Eurocentric Egyptology says that the priesthood of Amun developed during the early 18th dynasty, in which Hatshepsut rose to power. And according to the high priest of Amun list, Hatshepsut herself anointed the third high priest, Hapuseneb. However, like most things in ancient Kemet, the chronology is much likely much more older, and in my humble opinion, the cult of Amun evolved for a long time before the official institutionalization of the Amun priesthood. What really happened at the time of Pharaoh Hatshepsut's mysterious death? During Hatshepsut's time, the strictly male Amun priesthood had long ago weaponized Kemet's sacred sciences into a messiah cult of control. The cult of Amun was an overt patriarchal power structure which legitimized the pharaoh's reign, built the temples, maintained the temples, and oversaw religious life for the ancient Egyptians. The cult centered around the male pharaoh being a living embodiment of the god Amun, which translates to darkness or dusk, and corresponds to the fifth stage of the sun and the fifth age of precession, from which the Christian word Amen is derived. Thus, the pharaoh and the Amun priesthood had a toxic codependency. The pharaoh needed the Amun priesthood to legitimize his right to rule over the people, commission his statues, and consecrate his image. Meanwhile, the Amun priesthood needed the pharaoh's cooperation in religious rituals in order to maintain their entire civilization's religious order. There were strict rituals performed coronating any new pharaoh. The Amun priesthood were no dummies. Many of them were well-educated scribes, astronomers, and shamans who very much understood the secrets of the ancient Nubians and ancient Egyptians. Throughout their evolution and devolution, the Amun priest weaponized inherited tradition against the very people whom their sacred wisdom was intended to uplift. Hatshepsut's ascendancy to pharaoh boldly disrupted thousands of years of patriarchal tradition. I'll employ an admittedly reductive metaphor by claiming the Amun priesthood were like the OG snake oil televangelist of their day, selling salvation, fear-mongering about ever-eternal damnation waiting non-believers from a punitive sky daddy. Ergo, the Amun priesthood cultivated immense influence via religious hierarchy, tithing, aka donations to the temples, and psycho-spiritual gaslighting to control the population. Now, some of my astute witches in the collective coven may have noticed they're wearing leopard skins. Why is that? Well, the Amun priesthood, we can theorize, wore leopard skins for a variety of potential reasons. One of them is that the spots on the leopard skin symbolize the stars, the cosmos, since many of the Amun priests were astronomers. However, like most things in ancient Kemet, there are multidimensional implied meanings. There are layers to the symbolism, and in my humble opinion, it is not a coincidence that there is feline imagery, the feline archetype being invoked by the Amun priesthood wearing leopard skins. In my humble opinion, this connection to the Sphinx could be, again, the Amun priests were acknowledging the true origins of their sacred sciences, their sacred wisdom, a wink and a nod. Now, coming back full circle to Pharaoh Hatshepsut, Hatshepsut undoubtedly understood what corrupt forces of male mediocrity she was going up against when she declared herself Pharaoh. The Amun priesthood commodified Kemet's sacred sciences for profit, wisdom which they surely did not invent, but rather inherited, as we have learned. Kemet's legacy of spiritual wisdom stems from the deep matriarchal times of Zep Tepi, aka the first time in prehistoric Nubia. Therefore, ancient matriarchal power structures, for example, the mystery school of Isis, did not disappear during Kemet's descent into patriarchy. They simply went underground. The Amun priesthood embodied the cosmic principle of decline or atrophy. The cult of Amun likely consolidated power during patriarchal dynastic Egypt, which officially began around 3114 BCE during a descending age of precession. This date falls right within the last age of Taurus, of 4580 BCE to 2420 BCE. Note, dates differ depending on your calendar and mean measurements of the precessional cycle. In Vedic astrology, Taurus is ruled by Venus, governs sexual procreation, corresponds with the arts, and invokes the core psychic impulse of the crystallized creative urge. In the tarot, Taurus corresponds with the Hierophant, the Empress, the King of Swords, and the Knight of Pentacles arcanas. Intuitively, it makes sense, therefore, how codified for-profit religion, centralized public institutions, religious soft power, and patriarchal priestly authority would develop during a descending age of Taurus. This age was preceded by an age of Gemini, ruled by Mercury, invoking the core psychic impulse of polarization, i.e. the yin to the yang, spirit and matter, subjectivity versus objectivity. With this expanded context, it seems that astrology can provide insights into how the patriarchal cult of Amun developed during a descent into duality. This theme of descent is key. In the preceding age of Gemini, subtle spirit begins to further descend into matter, with the immaterial polarization forces then fully materializing into duality during the age of Taurus. Separation of the sexes likely actualized during this age of Gemini and age of Taurus, considering these archetypes invoke the religious themes like subject and object, or I and thou ways of thinking. Was this age of Taurus the beginning of sky daddy issues, internalized misogyny, and the toxic masculine ego which separates the subjective self from his object of desire? In my humble opinion, the cult of Amun is undoubtedly a rotten root of the modern patriarchal psyche, male-dominated religion, narcissism, the control freak complex, and toxic masculinity. The last age of Taurus then transitioned into the last age of Aries from 2420 BCE to 250 BCE. In Vedic astrology, Aries is ruled by Mars, governs the blood, corresponds with war, and invokes the core psychic impulse of moving energy. In the tarot, Aries corresponds with the Emperor, Queen of Wands, and Knight of Pentacles arcanas. Clearly, this age of Aries manifested further descent down the rabbit hellhole that is the Emperor's ego. During the transition from matriarchy to patriarchy, more likely a dominance display, the toxic masculine ego developed deeply internalized procreation envy. The last age of Aries clearly witnessed the fragile mediocre male ego explore its trauma bond with war, hierarchy, and domination. During matriarchy, we know that the queen mothers and high priestesses use menstrual blood in ceremony, not sacrificial blood. I intuit it was during these declining zodiacal ages that the patriarchal cult of Amun deluded itself into believing blood from death is the same as blood from life. Cow cults existed in the deepest prehistory of Africa, yet it seems the brutal practice of bull sacrifice was codified and institutionalized during these descending ages of dynastic Egypt. Since Mars governs blood in Vedic astrology, it makes sense that ritualized violence developed during the last age of Aries. Especially if during the preceding age of Taurus, bull sacrifices began, then I intuit all that blood from death would energetically attract the chaos to come in the age of Aries. With the golden age long gone, it makes sense that the Sphinx is also a marker of a past age of Leo in the precessional cycle of the equinox. John Anthony West said the Sphinx was not from the last but penultimate age of Leo, dating around 36,000 BCE, which is roughly 1.5 precessional cycles ago. As a symbol, the Sphinx is a curious example of only 2 known cases in Egyptian iconography of a reverse therianthrope, or an animal with a human head. The vast majority of the gods are the polar opposite, human bodies with the heads of animals, aka therianthropes, the Greek word for beast man. Thus, we are being called by the master builders of the Sphinx and by Hatshepsut, whom commissioned no shortage of Sphinx sculptures in her likeness, to pay particular attention to this archetype. In my humble opinion, the lioness, Sekhmet, and Sphinx archetypes in the art invoke the power of the untamed yin polarity to the self-contained yang. It is a subtle wink and nod to Kemet's matriarchal prehistoric roots. For example, it is common knowledge in Eurocentric Egyptology that high-ranking scribes and priests wore women's wigs to denote their social status. This tradition had nothing to do with gender identity. Wearing a woman's wig meant that they were the wisest of men. These gender-bender wigs further support the idea that Egypt's sacred sciences were stolen women's wisdom developed in matriarchal times. Even the pharaohs, symbols of peak patriarchy, maintained matrilineal bloodlines. Whenever a new pharaoh took over, he always married the old pharaoh's daughter in order to claim legitimacy to the throne. Why would they do that? This curious matrilineal tradition is seemingly at odds with patriarchal succession of pharaohs from father to son. Perhaps it is implying to us that the ancient Egyptians understood mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is special because it's maternally inherited, meaning it's passed down only from the mother's side. This unique inheritance pattern, along with mitochondrial DNA's higher mutation rate and smaller size compared to nuclear DNA, makes it a valuable tool for tracing maternal ancestry and understanding human evolution. Because mitochondrial DNA can be used to trace maternal lineages back through generations, it offers insights into ancient migration patterns and archaic human history. Additionally, mitochondrial DNA is relatively resistant to degradation, even in old samples like bones or teeth. Mitochondrial DNA's high copy number within cells and its resistance to degradation make it useful in forensic science and other fields. Mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, responsible for generating energy through cellular respiration. The genes encoded in mitochondrial DNA are crucial for the proper functioning of this process. With that brief science summary of mitochondrial DNA, it is hopefully now self-evident how advanced ancient Egyptian science truly was. If from the beginning Kemet inherited its sacred sciences, surely then it wasn't patriarchal, dynastic Egyptians who figured out how matrilineal succession works. In relation to the mystery of mitochondrial DNA, this tradition of a new pharaoh marrying the past pharaoh's daughter is undoubtedly a legacy of ancient matriarchal wisdom, which was inherited and distorted. Even in the depths of descent into corruption, matrilineal matriarchy was still covertly honored within patriarchal dynastic Egypt. Matriarchal traditions never ceased, even as dynastic Egypt devolved into patriarchy. They simply were stolen and co-opted by the Amun priesthood, or protected and adapted by the mystery school of Isis. Pharaoh Hatshepsut's bloodline features a number of powerful women behind famous pharaohs, such as Amenhotep IV, who shared power with his great royal wife, Queen T. The formidable mother of Akhenaten, Queen T, is the subject of a famous sculpture made of her likeness in the headdress of Isis. Akhenaten ruled with Nefertiti as co-regents, and they were always depicted as equals in the Amarna art. Thus, the archetypal feminine was honored throughout the 18th dynasty. It makes logical sense that T, Nefertiti, Meritaten, and Ankhesenamun all followed in Hatshepsut's footsteps on a very ancient path. The mystery school of Isis was the subtle power player in Kemet's evolution and devolution, the hidden hand, completely invisible from Egyptology's patriarchal retelling, aka gaslight, of the ancient past. Hatshepsut's history is but one example of patriarchy's nasty little habit of literally erasing powerful women from history whom challenge mediocre men's fragile egos. Ergo, what does Hatshepsut truly represent in relation to the mystery of the Sphinx, the mysteries of Atlantis, Tasseti, and prehistoric Nubia, the mystery of matriarchal, matrilineal, and maritime civilizations? As the mystery school of Isis went underground and covert, the queen mothers and high priestesses undoubtedly planted seeds for the resistance to flower as they witnessed patriarchal power structures devolving Kemet's once sacred science into corrupt religion. If the entire 18th dynasty bloodline were initiated into this covert matriarchal mystery school, which predates the Amun priesthood by eons, then perhaps here we are witnessing an ancient power struggle that transcended a mere difference in religion. What are the hidden shadow power dynamics of a covert matriarchal power structure, which is far more ancient than the overt patriarchal power structures? Isis corresponds to the star Sirius and is an ancient archetype. Isis is present in Tasseti Nubian art, a culture we know was matriarchal, whom preceded the ancient Egyptians. Thus, it is a logical conclusion to deduce that the lore of the Sirius star and its corresponding Sotic calendar also precedes patriarchal dynastic Egypt. How long would it require to acquire such vast accumulated wisdom about Sirius stars A and B? Unfortunately, the original temple of Isis in modern Egypt has been destroyed, but many legends speak of a secret temple of Isis being located in chambers beneath or inside the Sphinx by a Dr. Carmen Bolter. If Hatshepsut were initiated into the mystery school of Isis, this would also seemingly explain why her bloodline was in direct opposition to the Amun priesthood and would risk a cold war that would manifest great civil unrest. Why would the mystery school of Isis risk going public with their power during the 18th dynasty? It indeed was a great risk, and the repercussions were severe. As an initiate, Hatshepsut would have been aware of the Sphinx's true antiquity as a relic from Zep-Tepi, the first time. Hatshepsut would have been taught that the Sphinx is a sacred structure from the last golden age of matriarchy, not the manifestation of one egomaniac pharaoh's fear of historical irrelevancy. On the contrary, Hatshepsut likely learned that the Great Sphinx encodes in stone advanced knowledge of astronomy, cosmology, mathematics, harmonic proportion, the golden ratio, and geomancy. The Sphinx, as an equinoctial marker, proves it is sacred architecture not built out of ego, but out of service to future generations. The Sphinx is but one example of the global phenomenon of ancient megalithic sites which feature sacred sky-ground alignments, uniting heaven and earth. The Sphinx, in my humble opinion, is the self-evident embodiment of the sacred science which Kemet inherited from Atlantis. This sculpture, carved out of living bedrock, is a manifestation of the wise mantra, as above, so below, as within, so without. That wisdom is hidden in plain sight, as they say. What this means is there's invisible information encoded in the physical structure itself. The uninitiated will gaze upon the Sphinx and be oblivious to its true implications, as only the initiated can interpret this hidden wisdom. While there are secret tunnels and chambers under or within the Sphinx, which many explorers have gone into searching for Edgar Cayce's prophesied Hall of Records, this does not rule out the self-evident truth that the physical Sphinx herself embodies the wisdom such a Hall of Records contains. It is important to remember that explorers seeking fame and fortune often tend to romanticize what any Hall of Records truly would be, which leads to mass misunderstandings. Repeat, the Sphinx herself is the Hall of Records, a self-evident embodiment testifying to the master builder's capabilities and wisdom. The water weathering and erosion on the Sphinx is indisputable. Therefore, it is from an epoch of time with heavy rainfall in Egypt's past. There is resistance to this self-evident truth because it takes us out of the patriarchal era and Eurocentric timelines into an ancient Kemet and Nubia pre-Ice Age. Racist and sexist Egyptologists will therefore deny or disregard all the evidence proving the Sphinx is from this matriarchal era. Therefore, whatever a lost matriarchal civilization leaves behind in a Hall of Records, it's probably not going to be obvious or recognizable to the modern patriarchal mind. The Sphinx, in a way, is a living, breathing Hall of Records. natural structures enhanced by the human hand and train or vibe with subtle energies via sacred geometry and harmonic proportion. The golden ratios of sacred architecture is but one aspect which manifests the embodiment of spirit and matter. The regal Sphinx is inviting any seeker who has the privilege to gaze upon her to see what's hidden in plain sight. Who Hatshepsut truly was as a female pharaoh is undoubtedly connected to the mystery of the Sphinx. The implications of Hatshepsut's connection to the Sphinx are something traditional Eurocentric Egyptology downplays, since they are determined to deny the Sphinx's true antiquity and ignore the mystery of it all. Pharaoh Hatshepsut embodied the feral feminine power of the lioness goddess Sekhmet, a warrior priestess who sacrifices love and light for move and fight wherever there is injustice. Whilst Hatshepsut was objectively not successful in her attempts to realign ancient Kemet with its matriarchal values, her memory by some miracle still lives on. Her legacy persists, just like the legacy of matriarchy, just like the legacy of the mystery school of Isis, despite patriarchy's unsuccessful attempts to erase Hatshepsut's herstory forever from history. Thank goddess those bitter old men failed and died. Otherwise, we would never have known about this remarkable, badass, black African woman, Pharaoh Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut perhaps dared to challenge the patriarchal status quo because she operated under a grander vision of the long game. Pharaoh Hatshepsut seemingly planted the seeds during her reign for the revolution against the corrupt Amun priesthood, which her direct descendants, Akhenaten and Nefertiti, later led in the 18th dynasty. By closing the temples and renouncing the old gods, Akhenaten and Nefertiti basically declared cold war against the corrupt Amun priesthood. It was likely the Amun priesthood who funded or orchestrated the assassinations of Akhenaten, Tut, and potentially other Amarna royal family members. Remember, it has been proven by archaeology that the Amun priesthood completely dismantled Amarna, Akhenaten and Nefertiti's new capital city, brick by brick, and used its recycled materials to construct new temples. So, there are many mysteries, hidden truths, and shadow power dynamics which have been lost to the sands of time. However, Hatshepsut and Nefertiti, as empowered female heads of state, both likely fully understood that the corrupt Amun priesthood's power of weaponized religion stemmed from stolen women's wisdom. Therefore, no wonder it takes an amateur pseudo-archaeologist such as myself to ask the questions Eurocentric Egyptologists don't even have the curiosity to ponder. We are piecing together a great puzzle regarding ancient timelines from which only fractions of physical evidence still exist. The mysterious Amarna period is a true enigma, considering Akhenaten and Nefertiti's capital city was completely destroyed during King Tut's reign. Egyptology's neat little narratives about King Tut's reign being, quote, Egypt's great restoration, unquote, of traditional polytheism after a bout of mad monotheism utterly hides the mystery, clouding our perceptions of what really happened during the Amarna period. It's not a long shot to say that modern Egyptological lore surrounding Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and King Tut, and Pharaoh Hatshepsut descends from the Amun priesthood's political propaganda. Following Akhenaten's mysterious death, the Amun priesthood immediately changed King Tut's official name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, consecrated a restoration stela, and the old temples were reopened, which Akhenaten and Nefertiti had closed. Let's therefore remember King Tut was only 9 years old when he became pharaoh. A boy king is obviously an easy puppet to manipulate. It was via King Tut's regressive and short-lived reign through which the Amun priesthood quickly reestablished their religion's control. We must understand this original cultural context in order to piece together the puzzle. Egyptologists tell us that we're supposed to believe that the Amun priesthood were the good guys who saved ancient Egypt from this crazy religious royal family who got rid of the old gods all because they just wanted to worship the sun. This savior versus heretic narrative is not what happened at all. Akhenaten and Nefertiti did not worship the physical sun, nor did they create a new monotheistic religion just because they felt like it. Akhenaten and Nefertiti were attempting to return Kemet to its original spirituality before the times of corruption, just like Pharaoh Hatshepsut before them. Their reigns symbolize a return to the old ways, not the new. If you are still with me, thank you so much, dearly beloved. Let's now dive even deeper into the mystery of the Sphinx. If you can believe it, there are more levels. So buckle up, buttercups, because we're about to level up and read about the archaeological discovery that is expanding our awareness of how truly ancient the Sphinx is through the lens of archaeosculpture. People who actually work with stone have much more relevant perceptions and theories and ideas about megalithic structures versus armchair anthropologists and Eurocentric Egyptologists.
Mahit Stump, Unmasking the Great Sphinx of Giza by Robert S. Nayland. Abstract. The current mainstream model of history proposes that 4th Dynasty King Khafre had the Great Sphinx carved from the bedrock of the Giza Plateau in approximately 2500 BCE, and that the entire statue, including its head, neck, and body, was sculpted from the 3 raw substrate limestone layers of the Mokattam Formation de Novo at the same time. However, a growing body of evidence suggests that the Great Sphinx is older than the date commonly ascribed to its construction, and that the head and neck were merely remodeled from a prior sculpture to create the face of the Great Sphinx sometime during the Old Kingdom. The following archaeosculptural analysis of the Great Sphinx subjects the monument to a detailed reconstructive examination to demonstrate the existence of a previously unreported contour signature, which suggests a modification to a prior sculpted structure that was partly removed and/or altered. This discovery provides a basis for an empirical method which may aid in the relative dating of the stone layers belonging to the neck and body of the Great Sphinx to determine if they were indeed created at the same time or in different eras. Introduction. Despite circumstantial archaeological and Egyptological evidence dating the creation of the Great Sphinx to the 4th Dynasty, there is no unequivocally conclusive evidence when or by whom it was carved. Based on geological and astronomical evidence, some researchers have proposed that the monument was carved at an earlier date, and its head was merely recarved in dynastic times. Textual evidence suggests that the monument was originally a lioness. An analysis and discussion of this evidence, pro and con, is outside the scope of this paper. However, it makes a testable prediction. If the head of the Great Sphinx was indeed recarved from the head of an older, original lioness statue as proposed, a plausible sculptural reconstruction of the original monument must, in principle, demonstrate that all known sculptural elements present throughout its history, even if no longer existing, can be contained inside the original head and neck of the reconstructed lioness simulating sculpture.
Ergo, like many ancient megalithic sites, there are multiple layers
of construction, implying different eras of construction and or different eras of cultural renovations. This, as a general principle, holds true at so many ancient megalithic sites around the globe.
Figure 2. Reconstruction of the hypothetical lioness statue in sculpture. Using historical and contemporary references, photographs and descriptions from history, photographs and visual inspections made in person when touring the site in May 2019. This is the purpose of the study I here present. My contribution to the debate about the age and construction of the Great Sphinx rests on a reconstructive analysis and interpretation of weathering and sculptural aspects of the shape-changing process which created it from its proposed origin as a lioness statue. This process involves the subtractive reduction of a multi-ton dense and brittle bedrock medium, i.e. the three-layered Mokattam limestone formation, into a desired sculptural result using only hand tools, which I here simulate.
Therefore, if the proposed idea is true, that the original head of the Sphinx was in fact a lioness, and the human face that we are familiar with now was recarved in later times, then this expands the chronology by a vast scale, because it was certainly a matriarchal era, in my humble opinion, not a patriarchal era that carved a black African woman's face into the lioness original sculpture.
Conclusion. The preceding archaeosculptural analysis provides a roadmap to predict and establish an empirical method to confirm prior sculptural elements on the Great Sphinx of Giza, and demonstrates that 1. A proportional lioness head can spatially contain all subsequent sculptural elements historically displayed by the Great Sphinx. 2. There is a previously unreported forensic neck print, which is the contour signature of an alteration which reduced the lioness's neck at the time of recarving, possibly to fashion the Nemi's tail. If the hump was indeed the root of the original neck, the entire statue would have been proportional. Thus, the hump could be a remnant stump. 3. This new model of the evolution of the disproportionate Great Sphinx from a pre-existing proportional lioness statue predicts that the original neck area and the contiguous back and rump have been exposed to different time-dependent degrees of weathering due to sun, radiation, wind, sand, and rain, and these differences may be measurable to put the model to the test. Sculpture is a primary modality of sub-verbal communication for cultures that generally predates written symbology. As a vehicle for expressing the cosmology and aspirations of ancient peoples, it can provide a unique window to learning about their beliefs. This is especially true when the effects of reuse, repurposing, or appropriation can be identified as markers of the change and evolution of cultures. Archaeosculptural analysis may provide a useful tool for looking at other monuments in antiquity through the lens of sculpture and stoneworking. Examples include the adjacent Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple of Khafre, ostensibly comprised of stone quarried from the Sphinx enclosure. The conclusion presented here indicate that the existing head and core body of the Great Sphinx were not carved at the same time. Confirmation of this prediction through exposure-sensitive markers will mean that the creation of the iconic statue must be ascribed to a different author and to a different era than is commonly accepted. This in turn will require a re-examination of our understanding of the chronology and sequencing for the unfolding of the entire Giza Plateau. It impacts the who, what, when, how, and why of the complex, with rippling implications for the advent of pre-dynastic civilization in Egypt.
To recapitulate, this archaeosculptural analysis confirms that the body of the Sphinx was carved in a different era versus the head and neck of the Sphinx. This archaeosculptural analysis triangulates information coming from archaeoastronomy and geology and astrology regarding the Sphinx's true antiquity and origins. Let's now switch lanes to archaeoastronomy and archaeoastrology to further explore some of the more specific salient points about the Great Sphinx, being an equinoctial marker, ground manifestation of the Leo constellation, which it mirrors, and celestial guardian of the other side, the underworld, the invisible realms of spirit.
Quote via America Before by Graham Hancock. The Underwater Panther and the Great Sphinx. Other notable curiosities include the fact, noted earlier, that the serpents of the Duat are very often winged, and in addition are sometimes depicted with legs and feet. The same goes for the great horned water serpent, almost always winged, and in addition, in a Sioux account, described as a water monster which resembled a rattlesnake, but he had short legs. Because we have the benefit of copious documentation and painted and engraved images, the descriptions of the Duat that have come down to us from ancient Egypt are more vivid and detailed than the descriptions of the path of souls that have survived from the Native American oral tradition. Nonetheless, enough remains to confirm that, as well as serpents, many of the other monsters and fiends of the Duat also have their counterparts on the Native American afterlife journey. Of particular interest in this respect is the underwater panther, a bizarre hybrid figure described by the Ojibwa as a curious combination of cougar, rattlesnake, deer, and hawk, and understood to be an avatar, or alter ego, of the great horned water serpent. Different Native American peoples gave different names and aspects to the underwater panther. Michibeshu and Michibichi are the most common, but it was also known among the Algonquian-speaking tribes as Pisha, meaning panther. On account of this latter name, and of an ancient image of it that was once visible painted on a bluff above the Mississippi at Alton, Illinois, the underwater panther became known to interested European travelers as the Piasa, and was described confusingly both as a tiger and as an animal of the dragon species. In 1839, Arends and Company of Dusseldorf published a line drawing of it, taken on the spot by artists from Germany, which is reproduced above. The original petroglyph no longer exists, as the whole face of the bluff on which it was depicted was quarried away in 1846-47. Other imagery of the underwater panther, long since lost, was seen by Nicolas Perrault in 1664, who called it the Great Panther, while the Ojibwa today describe it as a sea tiger, preserving its watery associations, and as a huge brown cat. In some accounts, it is said that the Piasa has a human head. If the variety of descriptions is bewildering, we should not be surprised, for we are dealing with the netherworld and its shape-shifting denizens here. That the underwater panther was seen as having feline characteristics, however, is certain from a number of surviving images of this creature. Among them is a pottery figure reproduced in the collage below, that I was able to see for myself in the Museum of Moundville. Although the scale is completely different, I suggest that it bears more than a passing resemblance to the Great Sphinx of Giza. The Sphinx, of course, has a human head, not the head of a feline, but let's keep in mind those traditions in which human-headed piastres are described. Also possibly of relevance here is the evidence that the original prehistoric Sphinx, perhaps more than 12,000 years old, had the head as well as the body of a lion. After suffering severe erosion over several millennia, the leonine head was recut into human form during the early dynastic period. Last but not least, Native American traditions of the underwater panther speak of a time when 4 piastres existed, each associated with its own cardinal direction. Is it a coincidence that the Great Sphinx of Giza, with its strong family resemblance to the underwater panther, is an equinoctial marker, oriented precisely to one of the 4 cardinal directions, to face the sun as it rises due east on the equinox?
I'll interject and offer this interpretation insight that it's important to remember with the ancient Egyptians' worldview that the Nile River was the mirror image of the Milky Way. The Milky Way was the cosmic river of the sky, if you will. So perhaps with that being remembered, we can understand some of this mysterious water panther imagery and archetypal lessons of the Duat, which is the cosmic underworld. Also, perhaps the fire-water duality here, that sacred polarity is being invoked with the Leo correspondence.
The Great Sphinx of Egypt is an equinoctial marker. At the summer solstice, the sun rises far to the north of east, and at the winter solstice far to the south of east. But on the equinox, the sun rises due east in direct alignment with the gaze of the Sphinx. The Constellation Leo and the Great Sphinx, by Robert Goebel. Quote, "It has long been believed, and still is, by Egyptologists that the ancient Egyptians did not know the zodiac, and that it, the so-called Greco-Babylonian zodiac, was brought into Egypt sometime in the 3rd or 4th century BCE, probably by the Greeks. This may indeed be so for the Babylonian zodiac, but it does not necessarily follow that the ancient Egyptians did not have a zodiac of their own, or did not identify certain constellations along the zodiacal belt that were important to them. I very much believe they did have a 4-constellation zodiac, and I will endeavor to show this here. In the course of 1 year, the sun appears to travel along a set path against a background of fixed stars. Astronomers call this path the ecliptic. There are clusters, constellations, of stars along this path that are very reminiscent of certain animals or objects that were familiar and common to most ancient cultures. These clusters are known as the zodiacal constellations, which is a derivative from the Greek word zodiakos, meaning circle of animals. One of these zodiacal constellations is Leo, the lion. The writer Nancy Hathaway noted in her friendly guide to the universe, Leo resembles the lion after which it is named. Hathaway, 1964. Indeed, this constellation inspired many ancient cultures to identify it as a crouching or striding feline, usually a lion. In Egypt, it was depicted as a lion on a skyboat in the 2 zodiacs of Dendera, and also in other zodiacs painted on the lids of sarcophagi, all dating from the Greco-Roman period. Egyptologists and astronomers agree that this lion is Leo, but are adamant that the ancient Egyptians did not know Leo before the Greco-Roman period, and thus any lions shown on astronomical drawings before the Greco-Roman period are deemed not to be the constellation we call Leo. The most outspoken on this matter is Edwin Krupp, director of the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles. According to Krupp, despite some wishful thinking, the Egyptian lion constellation was probably not Leo. Krupp's view on this issue was, however, hotly opposed by Russian astronomer Alexander Gerstein, one-time president of the International Astronomy Union Commission on the History of Astronomy. According to Gerstein, not only did the ancient Egyptians know the zodiacal constellation of Leo long before the Babylonians, Greeks, and Romans, but also the Great Sphinx was a symbolic image of Leo and Aquarius. According to my conclusion, the Great Sphinx is a symbolical image for 2 constellations, Leo, summer, and Aquarius, winter. Gerstein, 1999. Also more recently, a Spanish astronomer specializing in ancient Egyptian astronomy, Juan Belmonte, PhD, of the Teide Observatory on the island of Tenerife, as well as his colleague José Lul, and Egyptologists have jointly published their views that Leo was known in the New Kingdom, thus some 1,000 years before the Greco-Roman period in Egypt. Archaeo-astrology summary. Quote by GrahamHancock.com. The gaze of the great Sphinx targets the rising sun at dawn on the equinox. Insert right, when night and day are of equal length. Probable age of Leo marker around 36,000 BCE.
Many sacred megalithic ancient sites are equinoctial markers or solstice markers. In particular, the equinoxes were spiritually important to the ancient peoples because that was when the yin and yang forces of night and day were at equilibrium and the veil between realms was thin. The ancient elevated ancestors also observed in which constellation was the rising sun during the equinoxes when days and night were of equal length in order to calculate the precession of the equinoxes. In my humble opinion, I personally resonate with Dr. Carmen Bolter's perspective that the civilization we understand to be Atlantis went through multiple precessional cycles, i.e. it went through multiple cycles of 26,000 years through the precession of the equinoxes. And Dr. Carmen Bolter's research has revealed that the civilization we understand to be Atlantis went through not just one major catastrophe, but at least 3. Therefore, in my humble opinion, I personally resonate with the Sphinx being even older than 36,000 BCE and likely from 61,500 BCE because that places it within the time window of ancient Nubia. Remember that site, Afad 23, that is at least 70,000 years old.
Hashtag Eyes on Sudan.
It all started with a youth-led revolution in 2019, which brought down Sudan's longtime president Omar al-Bashir. A transitional civilian government was then put in place, but 2 years later, that was overthrown by the military.
All right, some news from Sudan. Sudan is in the grip of a very deadly cholera outbreak, one of the worst in recent years. In just 10 days, cholera cases have surged from 90 to over 800 a day. That's more than 2,500 cases of infection. At least 170 people are reported as dead. The epicenter is Khartoum and Durman. If you remember, Khartoum has just been declared free of the RSF. So people are actually returning to Khartoum. More than 34,000 people have returned to the city itself. But remember that city has already been devastated by the war before, and that's just adding to it. The war caused there were some attacks on the power plants that have crippled the actual water system in that city itself, with no clean supply of water. Thousands and thousands of people are actually drinking contaminated water. So
it's an international conspiracy done by the global order that seems to be working together against the Sudanese people. What do I mean by that? Well, Amnesty has just released a report that Chinese-made weapons that are being sent to the UAE, that are being sent to the RSF.
So simply put it, our blood is only worth anything when it's converted into oil, when it's converted into golds. One US dollar is what, 80, 90 pounds in Sudan?
Flag is drenched with our blood, because you see, so many of our ancestors was killed because we have never accepted slavery.
You slavers will know what it's like to be a slave.
Just because we're in just because we're in the capitalist system doesn't mean we must love it. We were made slaves. It doesn't mean that while you're a slave you must love slavery. A conscious slave, while picking cotton on the plantation, is thinking about how to escape, how to bring freedom. Therefore, just because we're in capitalism doesn't mean we must enjoy it. We have to fight for an equal society. That's our history. Our people show that we spill blood instinctively to advance humanity, and we have this responsibility to advance America, yes, to a socialist state. From Africans, our oppressor has changed us to colored, to Negro, to this, to that. We understand it's a step. Coming to black had a powerful point, because the point was that we were oppressed because of this color of our skin, and this was racism. But this fight is not just a fight over the color of the skin. A fight for power is a fight for land. When Mr. Llewellyn speaks about power, he's talking about land. Our land is Africa. America is not our land. It belongs to the American Indians, and we have a right to stand and take a moral struggle with them. And we don't worry about people being for things. People want things is incorrect. The point is not to explain the world. The point is to change it.
As you describe Christian nationalism, I'm hearing a lot about foundation of governments. I'm hearing about politics. I'm hearing about laws. Not hearing a lot of God talk. How Christian is Christian nationalism?
Not very. I mean, if you think about it in terms of, what people call the red letter of the gospel, the words of Jesus, right? You don't hear the word Jesus very much. You hear about God and you hear about law. And so the way I would tell somebody to listen for Christian nationalism is to say, did you hear anybody say Jesus? Did you hear somebody say something about the golden rule? Did you hear anybody say turn the other cheek? You don't hear that when you talk about Christian nationalism. When I hear Christian nationalism in this country, and especially with this particular administration, I hear it as punitive. It is, an Old Testament God, or, if you want to talk about it like this, Hebrew Bible God, instead of a New Testament kind of environment of Christianity. So that's one.
Well, first of all, caste is essentially an arbitrary, artificial graded ranking of human value in a society. And we often think of that word applied to India, the most recognizable caste system in the world. And yet it turned out that our founding fathers actually replicated or created a parallel kind of hierarchy. But what they did was, you could use any number of metrics to create a caste system. You could use religion, you could use ethnicity, you could use immigrant status, language, all of that. But in our country, what the colonists chose to use was the metric of what people look like, meaning race. So race was the tool that was used to divide and to rank people, to determine who would be slave or free, who could own property or who could be property, and we still live with the after effects of that. You do not have to be in the dominant group, the dominant caste, in order to do its bidding. That we all have been exposed to and programmed to recognize what the hierarchy is. Whose
pattern of harassment is going on against the Black Panther Party across the country. On Friday, the Watts office of the Black Panther Party was bombed and demolished. Last week, the Des Moines office was bombed. They can't stop anything we're doing as a nonviolence is a very non-functional approach in a society that's based entirely on organized force and violence. A country that was created in violence, land was taken in violence, society that's perpetuating itself through violence in the ghettos, in Vietnam, in Africa, wherever you look. There's organized force and violence at work to maintain the society. There's a world of difference between 20 million unarmed people and 20 million people organized and armed to the gills. That's power.
Did you know Europe is named after an African woman? Yeah, let that sink in. The entire continent named after a non-European woman, and not just any woman, a Phoenician princess with roots deeply tied to ancient African culture. Her name was Europa. According to myth, she lived in Tyre, a powerful Phoenician city that traded with Egypt and Carthage, major African civilizations. Then Zeus, because he's Zeus, kidnaps her in the form of a bull and whisks her off to Crete. The Greeks were so obsessed, they named the whole region Europa in her honor. But here's the twist. Phoenicians weren't European. They were part of the Afro-Asiatic world, and Europa herself likely had African features, culture, and bloodlines. So the next time someone talks about Europe being the cradle of civilization, remind them it's literally named after a woman with African roots.
Astrology for Divination is proud to present Archaeo-astrology, Decolonize Your Horoscope, a free ebook.
So, quick question. How familiar are you with the ancient Egyptian race controversy? Well, I would argue that unless you've been living under a rock, if you've ever been confronted or even interested in the civilization of ancient Egypt, you will be confronted with this controversy. The question being, were they black, were they white, or were they something in between? Well, one thing that you might be surprised to know is that this debate was actually closed about 20 years ago, and this was in a study that no one ever talks about. So let's have a look at that together. The story of how this debate was ended actually begins with this man. This is Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop, and he was a Senegalese/French anthropologist, and he came up with a very, very smart idea. He essentially said, give me a small proportion or sample of the skin of one of the mummies and I can test for melanin density. And this took place in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
We have been taught to think of Egypt as a civilization whose golden age occurred 2,000 or 3,000 years before Christ. Imagining this magnificent culture springing from small settlements in biblical times makes us wonder whether we've got the timeline right. World cultures have myths that speak of high levels of consciousness, superior science, art, and architecture from eons ago. How do we reconcile this? We are trapped in our own concept of time, but many cultures think on a vastly different scale. Science has established that the earliest human remains are about 2.5 million years old. It has shifted our marker back, so that now we are able to conceive of human culture being much, much older. In Indian traditions, and in 30 other cultures, a 26,000-year cycle is accepted. How does that affect the traditional chronology of Egypt, which insists that the pyramids were constructed as recently as 2450 BC? Will this force the issue of rethinking the chronology of ancient Egypt? Every year, authors, scientists, and alternative thinkers come together for the Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge. They share ideas about ancient cultures, lost knowledge, and great cycles of time.
I started the Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge because I wanted to bring together the bright minds in this whole field of alternative history so we can put this very ancient puzzle back together again.
Geologists, physicists, engineers, and archaeoastronomers discuss the accepted dating of world history.
I'm convinced that there is a misunderstanding about the tenets of Egyptian civilization. And I'm convinced that there is misunderstanding about its datings.
To me as a geologist, it's unquestionable that the chronology has to be redone.
Knowledge of precession and advanced astronomy existed in extremely distant times.
So I think we're looking at a chronology that's far, far older than is accepted.
By integrating recent scientific discoveries in different disciplines, they define a new timeline of our past. The Egyptians provided us with concrete evidence that describes political events from a far more distant past than we can imagine. Why has this been overlooked?
The Egyptians themselves, in at least one stone tablet, the Palermo stone, and one papyrus, the Turin papyrus, they say that ancient Egypt is much, much older than the Egyptologists think it is. So to dismiss that is, of course, an assumption that contemporary Egyptologists know a lot more about ancient Egyptian history than ancient Egyptians do, which is a form of typical arrogance on the part of the academic community.
So why do we consider civilization to be only about 6,000 years old? Is it because of our limited imagination, or is there another reason?
Modern scholars tend to minimize the age because it fits better with the current paradigm of history. You know, the current paradigm is 5,000 years ago, man was hunter-gatherer. He had to have writing before he could build large structures or civilizations. He came together to protect himself from other warring parties and things like this. And so, for example, in Corral, Peru, when they found that amazing six-pyramid structure down there, they assumed it was built by the Incas, because that's only 500 years ago, and the Incas built most of South America. Well, when they got this very good carbon dating that shows it's 4,700 years old, it really blows a hole in current history theory. Generally, the academic community is just sort of silent about it right now because they don't have any good ideas with the current theories of history.
A cross-disciplinary approach helps us to put hard evidence and theory together to reach a greater understanding. If we consider the data coming from astronomy, geology, astrology, and climatology, we can arrive at new conclusions about the chronology of ancient Egypt.
We have two sciences that are playing with it. We have astronomy, we have geology. With the pyramids, we have a much more precise science. They've aligned the monuments. And they have the religious ideas locked to the machinery of the sky and the constellations and the sun and so forth. So we can use that with high precision and arrive at a date.
How does this information affect the dating of the Great Pyramid? Was it really built when Egyptologists say it was?
Well, the traditional date for the Great Pyramid is about 2550 or so BC. You know, give or take. I mean, people argue about the dates, and some people want to date it down to a particular year. I think that's a precision that's not justified whatsoever.
I like to use the metaphor of painting a house. If you painted your house last in 2003, that doesn't mean your house was built in 2003. So I subscribe to the notion that there was probably quite a lot of work done on the Great Pyramid in 2450 BC, but that it probably was built quite a bit earlier than that. There's something very threatening about changing the dates because it takes us out of the patriarchal era. But I think that there was a whole world of Egypt that existed in matriarchal times, and I think the evidence is quite strong for that.
There is absolutely no reason at all why the ancient Egyptians could not have worked out the precessional cycle. How do we approach the age? Well, you have a variety of methods when you're looking at an archaeological site. You have what we call the archaeological datings, which means you look at artifacts that you can fit into a chronology. You look at potsherds, stratas, but this can be very deceiving because it requires a lot of interpretation. Nonetheless, these are the methods that is predominantly used in archaeology. The other is carbon dating. Carbon dating is okay up to a point, and it's notoriously misleading if it's been contaminated and so forth. And besides, with many of these places, we do not have carbon datable material.
Carbon-14 dating works only on organic materials, but simply touching organic materials contaminates a sample. Stone cannot be carbon dated.
There is another form of dating, which is to use precessional astronomy.
What can we use to measure time? Are there markers that connect to the movement of the stars?
The stars would shift about 1 degree every 72 years.
It's not anymore in the same spot. Our planet is moving, but we can't feel it, not in the same position. And that was, it's in a change all the time. Nothing stands still. You know that our planet make a cycle every 24 hours, sunrise every 24 hours, right? But our planet also revolve in a different way.
Precession is the motion of the axis of the Earth, which wobbles like a spinning top due to gravitational pull.
They make one round every 26,000 years.
If you have a monument, for example, let's take one that we know for sure, the temple of Isis at Dendra. It's a small temple behind the Hathor temple. That one is 99% sure aligned to the rising of Sirius. So if we have certainty that the temple has its axis aligned to the rising of a star, and we know which star it is, then we can date it. It's very simple, we do it in a matter of minutes. This is known as precessional astrology. The star moves or appears to move because of the precessional wobble. We have a date.
Plato called a precessional cycle of 26,000 years a great year.
The great year is Plato's term for this vast cycle of time, one eon, one precession of the equinox. It's about 24,000 years. And there's over 200 myths that talk about this cycle of alternating dark and golden ages, or that make reference to a golden age in the distant past. 30 different cultures have passed down these myths from time to time, and they all related to the movement of the stars, which we know today as precession. Even Sir Isaac Newton himself wrote a book on it, trying to match history to each of the constellations of the zodiac, and it was wiped out by the Darwinian evolution paradigm, which came along, less than 200 years ago, where it became unacceptable to admit that a culture that lived long, long before us might know something that we don't know.